Hey everyone, welcome back to the Majesty of Reason. Today I'm joined by Dr. Tyron Goldschmidt. Thank you so much for joining me, and we're going to be discussing ontological arguments. He recently published a book with Cambridge University Press within the Elements series on that. Can you give us basically like a 60-second rundown of who you are and what your scholarly work focuses on?
My scholarly work focuses on metaphysics, philosophy of religion, some history of philosophy, some ethics too, and I guess this ontological argument stuff brings a lot of that together. I see it as a topic, an argument that gets us entangled in a lot of questions in different areas of philosophy.
Yeah, one of my favorite papers of yours is a demonstration of the causal power of absences, and it's the page is just blank. How did that one? Can you give us a little like story on that? Just like maybe 60 seconds or so.
It took me a while to delete so many words. I don't know. I don't have many words for it. I hope it does what it advertises itself as doing, demonstrating the causal power of absences. I take it to. Some people might deny such things. I had some trouble getting it, read by journal editors, because I would submit it and they would keep on asking me, where is the attachment? Where's the paper? You've sent your title and abstract. Where's the paper? And I had to explain, and it didn't help. It didn't help. But I tried to explain that the submission of an absence is different from the absence of a submission. But most, simply insisted that until I submit the paper, which I have mistakenly not submitted, they can't go ahead. Unfortunately, one journal understood the demonstration and sent it out for review, and it was accepted. So there it is. I have a forthcoming edited volume on related questions about non-existence and non-being. It's co-edited with Sarah Bernstein, and titled "Non-Being: New Essays on the Metaphysics of Non-Existence," and will soon be out with Oxford University Press. It's got a cool lineup of philosophers talking about non-being and non-existence and emissions and absences and all sorts of negative-ish philosophical topics, and topics that I think are related to ontological arguments too.
Oh, definitely. And so that kind of bridges into your particular book that you just that just came out with Cambridge University Press. So for the audience, I thought I would read the abstract just to, give a lay of the land of what he argues in the book, the stance that he takes, and so on. So the abstract is, proving the existence of God is a perennial philosophical ambition. An armchair proof would be the jackpot. Ontological arguments promise as much. This element studies the most famous ontological arguments from Anselm, Descartes, Plantinga, and others. While the verdict is that ontological arguments don't work, they get us entangled in fun philosophical puzzles, from philosophy of religion to philosophy of language, from metaphysics to ethics and beyond. So, what
Couldn't
was...
have said it better myself.
So, I guess just, again, another brief kind of introductory question. What was your kind of intent or purpose in writing this book? Like, why did you write it?
I like ontological arguments. I think they're fun. it was my job, to write philosophy. So, putting two and two together.
Yeah, no, that makes
Uh,
sense. Like that a lot of people ask me why I'm like interested in classical theism. I'm like, I just find it interesting and I like writing about it and reading about it. So that's a perfectly legitimate answer. So,
it's not because I want to convert or convince anyone that the
mhm.
ontological argument is sound. Um, um, I doubt I can do that, and I don't think that ontological arguments work in that sense. So my verdict is pessimistic. So that's not that's one of the that is I could tell you what was not a reason for my writing it.
Mhm. Yeah, yeah. Okay, so for the audience, essentially what we're going to try to do is go through some of the ontological arguments within Tyron's book, particularly Anselm's ontological argument, Descartes' ontological argument, and if we have time, Plantinga's modal ontological argument as well, and a bunch of different, perhaps, symmetry breakers that we might bring for the possibility premises therein. So, um, for the audience, whenever we mention a lengthy sort of premise by premise argument, that argument will be found in the description below. So when we're going through Anselm's ontological argument, you can find the premise by premise outline of it in the description, and you can like read it and consult it as we go through this together, as Tyrone and I talk about it. So the last set of kind of introductory questions is, at least broadly speaking, what is an ontological argument and what's the kind of relevant notion of God at play?
Oh, that's that's a hard question. What is an ontological argument, right? There are many of these arguments that are classified as ontological arguments. I think that Kant was the first one who gave the title to this class of arguments. What makes them a class? I mean, what brings them together is hard to put one's finger on. But the one thing about these arguments is that they're quite armchairish. They're not um, empirical. Some people have tried to prove that God exists on the basis of empirical observations, or that God doesn't exist on the basis of empirical observation. Some people try to reach conclusions about God on the basis of evidence from the external world. Look at the world, it's so beautiful. There must be a designer. Or look at these horrors in the world, it's so terrible. There can't be a benevolent designer. Um, in contrast, ontological arguments for the existence of God, um, they don't they don't depend on any particular evidence about the external world in that way. You're just supposed to sit in your philosophical armchair, think hard about the idea of God, the concept of God, the definition of God, or something like that. Some abstract metaphysical principles that, and if you think hard enough about them, pop, you see eventually that God must exist. It follows from these ideas, concepts, principles about God that there must be such a thing. And as to your second part of the question, well, what concept are we dealing with? Um, this also might distinguish ontological arguments from other arguments for the existence of God, which usually, or at least most directly, are supposed to show that there is some cosmic designer, or that there is a first cause of the universe, or um, uh, maybe these arguments show one or two divine attributes, that there is a being with one or two of these special features. Um, the ontological argument is supposed to show, it's supposed to have a more robust conclusion that it's proponents of the argument think that if it works, it shows that there is a being who is all knowing, all good, and all powerful, that there is a perfect being, a greatest possible being, a greatest conceivable being. This is the terminology that proponents of the argument usually use. There's some exceptions. Some proponents of the argument think that the argument does well and might, but might show less than that. And of course, some proponents of the other arguments for the existence of God, cosmological or design arguments and so on, might think that those arguments do show more than one or two attributes to some extent. So we should qualify this in some ways. But Basically, what distinguishes ontological arguments is its armchairishness. It's
Okay,
supposed to be an armchair proof for the existence of God.
that makes sense. So now we're going to move into Anselm's ontological argument. And before doing that, I think I forgot my water bottle, so I'll cut this part out. But I am dying of thirst, and I forgot my water bottle. Okay, so Anselm's ontological argument. I'm going to begin with a kind of 30-second rundown, and then afterwards I'm going to turn it to Tyron, and I'll ask him some questions. So the 30-second rundown, the kind of crash course, as it were, is that, well, God is the greatest conceivable being, or GCB, we could say. We understand the meaning of greatest conceivable being, and hence a greatest conceivable being exists in the understanding. Now, assume it exists only in the understanding, but not in reality. Well, then we could conceive of something greater than it, namely a being fitting the same description as it, but that actually exists in reality. But that's a contradiction, right? We have just concluded that we can conceive of something greater than the greatest conceivable being. And so our original assumption is false, namely the assumption that the greatest conceivable being exists only in the understanding and not also in reality. And since we already conceded that it exists in the understanding, it follows that the greatest conceivable being exists in reality. So that's the kind of rough sketch. Now, I know this is kind of a summary, but can you kind of take us through any maybe perhaps a requisite background as well as a kind of premise by premise form of the argument?
I think that was fine for a rough sketch and just fun. Um, it often is presented in that way as a kind of reductio, as some people call it. Start off with a certain assumption so that that assumption leads to a contradiction or to some absurdity. Okay. So, and then reject the assumption for doing that. So yeah, that's a kind of reasoning. And so the way you put it, Anselm, would be starting off assuming that God doesn't exist. Assume for the sake of argument and see where that leads. It leads us into some sort of contradiction, some sort of absurdity. So that assumption must have been mistaken. God must exist. And Anselm sets it up by quoting a verse in Psalms, famously, the fool says in his heart, there is no God. And Anselm takes his argument as a gloss on this. You're frozen, it seems. Am I frozen?
You were for a second. I don't know if you can
Okay.
hear me.
Okay, I can hear you, but you're frozen on this
Ah.
The idea is that this fool is a fool. Why? Because he's denied the existence of God, and if he thought about it hard enough, if he weren't a fool, he would see that he's kind of contradicted himself. What he said is absurd. Why? Because, as you put it, roughly, right? God is supposed to be the greatest conceivable being. Even the fool understands this. In order to deny that God exists, he must at least have the concept, the idea of this greatest conceivable being. But this being would be greater yet if it really existed. It's better to exist than not to exist. Being is greater for existing than not existing, or something like that. And so the fool must admit that that he can conceive then of something greater than this being that he has taken to be the greatest conceivable being. Okay. Since he takes the greatest conceivable being not to exist, he could conceive of something greater. That is, an existing being of that sort. You can't conceive of a being greater than the greatest conceivable being.
Mm-hmm.
So that original assumption that this being doesn't exist, the assumption the fool made, must be false. Now, that was a little bit tongue-twisting, and with the cutting out of the video and everything, I don't know if I conveyed that properly. But between my and your statement, maybe the listener can't.
And between the argument in the in the description. They'll be able to see that. And also for the audience, this will just be a bonus for you guys. I will include the document that we created with suitable touchings up. I'll include that in the description, and it has lots of different objections, and it goes through even bonus material that we're not going to go through on here. So definitely you guys are going to want to check out that document so you guys can see that.
You might even want to get the book, right?
Yeah, you'll also want to get the book as well. It's an excellent little book. So I think we should.
It is little.
Yeah, it is. Yeah. Now we should probably move into the objections to this kind of argument. And there are lots, of course, of different objections. So the first one that we will consider stems from essentially pinpointing an alleged underlying assumption of the argument, namely a kind of Meinongianism. Okay, so the first objection is something like premise 3 of the argument, which people can see in the description. It says roughly that even if God exists only in the understanding, it can be conceived to exist in reality. That makes a distinction between existence in reality, or Latin in re, versus existence in the understanding, or Latin in solo intellectu. But this requires the deeply controversial and, so the objector says, likely false view of Meinongianism. So can you sort of flesh out this objection further and maybe comment on it or, evaluate it for us?
The idea that Anselm has is that that we can kind of compare the greatness of God as existing versus the greatness of God as not existing. I mean, that's one way of putting it. Okay. That God is greater if God exists, or the greatest conceivable being would be greater for existing in reality than not. And you might wonder about whether making such comparisons are sensible, or whether Anselm's making the comparison relies on whether Anselm's making on the comparison relies on the assumption that there are non-existent objects or something like that, which is a controversial philosophical assumption.
Yeah, and that kind of brings us to the second point that I had on the document, which was like, I do ultimately, I think I agree with you that this is another way of putting the Meinongian worry, right? But
I don't know if it's like, I don't know. I don't read Meinong a lot, but
yeah.
there are a lot of different interpretations of what he's up to. This is, I mean, the way I present him in the book is the way I've received Meinong, and others have, but maybe it's not really Meinong's view.
Yeah.
But the idea is that there are non-existent objects, right? There are some things of which it's true to say that they don't exist, which is a little puzzling, right? There are things that don't exist. Okay, that seems strange. Does there are and exist mean different things, right? So that we can say that there are things, and yet these things don't exist. It seems strange, though the argument goes, or a part of it goes, we refer to such things all the time, right? Pegasus doesn't exist, Santa Claus doesn't exist, and so on. These are things, they don't exist. And there might be more sophisticated kinds of philosophical arguments for thinking that there are non-existent things. We might want to countenance non-existent things in order to make sense of talk of fictional objects. Okay. Talk of the past, right? The sentence, Meinong was a philosopher, is true, right? But he doesn't exist anymore. So what makes it true? Meinong, a non-existent thing. That's a little cartoonish. That's a little too simple. But there are there are there are ways of motivating this a little more plausibly, and there are proponents of the idea that besides the things that exist, you and me, there are spooky, non-existent things, or maybe we shouldn't call them spooky. They exist in the metaphysical. Well, they don't exist. They,
They subsist.
the metaphysical shadow realms, right?
Yeah.
And it's a weird idea. Like I say, there's some motivation for it that I flesh out a little bit in a little more detail in the book. Some philosophers buy this kind of stuff, most don't. Most think it's this idea of non-existent things is really silly, puzzling, obscure, and that the reasons that Meinong or maybe other philosophers have suggested for accepting that, for believing that there are such non-existent things, are bad reasons in the end. We can make sense of our fictional discourse or our talk about the past and so on in more straightforward ways that don't rely on non-existent objects. Okay. But the thought is that Anselm's argument does, because Anselm wants to say, look, on the one hand, think about God as existing, on the other hand, as not existing, and make this comparison. Okay, the existing God is greater than a non-existing God, and that thought, if we put it that way, maybe we could put it in better ways and still get at Meinongianism. That thought entangles us in, assumes a kind of Meinongian picture.
Yeah.
Which is false and silly and bad, and so Anselm's argument fails.
Yeah. And I think another way to kind of articulate this, and I was looking at your note here, and I think I ultimately agree, but for the audience, I think it'd be helpful for me to articulate this kind of objection in this way. And the objection is essentially like, listen, it makes no sense to talk of the greatness of a non-existent being except hypothetically as the greatness it would have if it existed. So, for instance, when we compare the greatness of things, we compare what the things would be like if they existed. Excuse me. Thus, when we say that Superman is greater than Spider-Man, right, we mean something like, if Superman existed, well, then he would be greater than Spider-Man would be if Spider-Man in turn existed. And to exist, so the argument goes, is to exist in reality. And so when you take the crucial claim in Anselm's argument that it's greater for something to exist in mind and in reality than just in mind, well, that claim would be simply false when we understand it in a kind of hypothetical way, right? Because then we would need to compare the greatness of the being that exists in the mind and reality to the greatness of that same being that exists only in the mind would have, the greatness that it would have if it existed in reality. And that's just the same greatness, because we're talking about the same being, like, God as existing in the mind, not in reality, and God as existing in reality. The hypothetical greatness in both cases, the greatness that they would have were they to exist, is identical. And so the central claim in Anselm's argument, so this objection goes, is false. So I was wondering if you had any further comments on that?
Yeah, maybe that gets at the same objection. Maybe. And my sense is that as I was writing the book and reading lots of different objections against lots of different ontological arguments, I had this feeling that a lot of these boil down to the same thing in slightly different words. Of course, there are a lot of different ontological arguments that are awfully similar, and objections against them, might be similar. But some people level objections against the same arguments in different words, but they seem to be getting at this in some way. And Anselm himself wants to say that the fool thinks that God exists in the understanding, and will admit that. Okay, and then we've got to think, if God exists in the understanding alone, does that get us into trouble? And Anselm wants to say, yeah. Okay, we say that God exists in the understanding alone, then we could conceive of a greater being than God. But as he defines it, God is the greatest conceivable being. Okay, so we can't say that God exists in the understanding alone. So God must exist in reality too. Oh, did I just present the argument in a neater way than I did originally? Probably. Um, I'm not thinking in a straight line.
Well, I think
Maybe listeners can piece it all together and make sense of it. But the idea, Anselm has this idea that there's this thing, existence in the understanding, and there are things that exist in the understanding versus in reality. What is that distinction? Maybe he has a kind of what we've called a Meinongian distinction between existent and non-existent things in mind. In which case, his argument is hostage to the fortune of Meinongianism. Is this weird philosophical idea going to pan out?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that makes sense. So let's move on to the kind of famous parody style argument to this ontological argument. Now, I have heard people pronounce it differently. I've heard some people pronounce it guanilo, like a UA, and other people say like gonilo or gonilo. I don't know about you. I'm just gonna say gonilo. That's all I'm gonna say. I'm gonna
Okay.
say a monk named Gonilo.
I'm not actually sure. Guanilo, Guano. I can
Exactly,
barely
it's
speak
baffling.
English. Tonight I can barely speak English.
So, okay, so
Doing a good
Gonilo, for
job.
those.
So let the least of my problems be that I'm not pronouncing a philosopher's name properly.
Okay, well, hopefully, yeah, hopefully. Okay, so your audience, you guys shouldn't crucify us for pronouncing it like Gonilo. Okay, so Gonilo raised a kind of
It's
parody
sort of
argument.
embarrassing. It happens every once in a while that you read about something a lot and maybe write about it and think about a person a lot or some idea but you've never heard it you've never had opportunity to say it yourself and be corrected, and you've never heard it in speech, and then you embarrass yourself by
Exactly.
it happens to people.
Yeah.
I've heard people pronounce it in different ways. I'm happy to go with Gonalo if you want.
Okay, sweet.
I've even seen people put an N at the end. Guanalon.
I
Gonal.
think I've seen that as well. It's really
Uh,
strange. Anyway, so
I
yeah, he
don't
raised
know
a
if all
parody
that
argument,
me.
and it's based on the notion of a greatest conceivable island. And so here's the parody argument, right? We understand the greatest conceivable island, that description. And so the greatest conceivable island exists in the understanding. For whatever is understood exists in the understanding according to Anselm. But if the greatest conceivable island existed in the understanding and not in reality, we could conceive of a greater island, namely one that exists both in the understanding and in reality that satisfies that description. That's a contradiction, right? We just conceived of an island that is greater than the greatest conceivable island. And so, by the reductio, right, the greatest conceivable island exists both in the mind and in reality. But, so Ganila says, right, that's absurd. And so there's no such thing as the greatest conceivable island. We should just reject that. And so, because the parity is perfectly symmetric, so Gonilo argues with Anselm's argument likewise fails. So the argument goes. So I'm wondering what you kind of make of this objection.
Make of it that you've put it as better than I would have, and I have little to say now. Um, yeah, and I hope that the listener now gets, after so many rounds of sort of hashing this through, what the ontological argument is about. This argument is supposed to be structurally similar.
Yeah.
It's supposed to have the same shape. So if it fails, and we must grant that it fails, surely you can't prove that it's the greatest conceivable island from the armchair.
Mm-hmm.
So there's this argument for the greatest conceivable island, the greatest possible island, an island in which no greater can be conceived, and so on, fails. But the ontological argument has the exact same form. All we've done is replace the word greatest conceivable being with the words greatest conceivable island, replaced God with perfect island or something like this. Okay. So if the parody fails, if there's some mistake, as there must be in this parody argument, then similarly there must be some mistake in the original ontological argument. That's the moral. So it doesn't show where the mistake is.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, it doesn't. Ganilo, Gonilo, Guanilo, Gaunilo, Guanalan, of whom we shall not speak, um, doesn't pinpoint exactly where the ontological argument goes wrong, but it's enough for us to show that it does go wrong, maybe.
Yeah. Yeah. So one of the ways you talk about in the book, in the chapter, of pushing back to this, or pushing back against this greatest conceivable island objection, comes from the likes of Plantinga and others. And essentially the response is that unlike the great-making features of beings as such, like knowledge and power and goodness and so on, the features that make an island great have no intrinsic maxima. Um, you can always add, for instance, one more coconut or one more chocolate volcano or one more Tyron Goldschmidt to make everything so much better, right? And so they don't have any intrinsic maxima, the features that make an island great. And so for any conceivable island you choose, right, you can always conceive of a greater island. Add one more chocolate volcano, add one more coconut, and so on. And so we cannot even make sense of a greatest conceivable island. And so so that's kind of preliminaries of what I'm going to say next with respect to this kind of intrinsic maxima objection. Although I'll pause at this juncture because I do have some responses to that, but I'll pause if you want to like add on to that my characterization there.
Once again, I couldn't have said it better myself. Okay, and this time I didn't say it better myself.
So, go
but
on.
yes, if repeating helps. And sometimes it does. I see with my students, repeating helps.
Mm-hmm.
Helps with me. The idea is that there is a crucial difference between the ontological argument and the island argument, right? There's a crucial difference, and the crucial difference is that we can put it in a few ways. The idea of God, of a greatest conceivable, makes sense. God is understood. God does exist in the understanding. Okay. Whereas you can't even get off the ground when we're talking about a greatest conceivable island. Okay. The idea doesn't make sense. Okay. Not only the thing doesn't exist, not in reality, doesn't even exist in those metaphysical shadow realms, right? That we were speaking about. There is no such thing as a greatest conceivable island. And why? Why I think that the greatest conceivable being makes sense, exists in the understanding and so on, but the island does not. Well, when it comes to the greatest conceivable being, we can make sense of the relevant features it's supposed to have. Being all powerful, being all knowing, being all good, and so on. Okay. But when it comes to the greatest conceivable island, what are the relevant features here? Okay. Having the greatest number of chocolate volcanoes? Okay. Well, for any number of chocolate volcanoes an island has, it could always have one more. Okay. So we don't have an idea of the greatest conceivable island. It doesn't so much as exist in the understanding, if you want to put it that way. Mm-hmm. End of story.
Yeah. Yeah, no, that makes sense. I'm wondering, so there might be a few ways to kind of push back on this rejoinder. I guess on behalf of our good pal, Big G, we can call him Big G, Gonolo.
Who replies on behalf of the fool.
Yeah, it's true. Yeah, so in some sense, we're all fools here, or at least you and I are. No, at least I am, because I'm kind of defending here and pushing back. Okay, so I guess like here's how we might respond. Surely the greatest conceivable island would be infinitely capacious, right? Inexhaustible in its opportunities for fun and relaxation and delight and so on. And so surely then it would have infinitely many coconuts and infinitely many chocolate volcanoes and infinitely many opportunities for fun. But in that case, adding one more coconut or chocolate volcano doesn't actually increase the island's greatness, right? Since the number of coconuts and chocolate volcanoes after such addition would be identical. It's just Aleph null or Aleph naught. So what do you think about that kind of infinitely capacious response?
I want to first say that when it comes to God, it's not uncontroversial that the idea of an all-powerful, all-knowing, and all-good being does make sense. It's not uncontroversial. I mean, I think it makes sense. But many critics will say that the parity and is no worse position than the ontological argument here, because we can't really wrap our minds around the idea of a all-powerful, all-knowing, and all-good being, and there's some deep confusion in these, in our thinking about these features. They're impossible features. But I don't know whether you've made it more plausible. On the other hand, that you've made it plausible that the greatest conceivable island is in as good a position as the greatest conceivable being. You speak about, well, maybe it does make sense to have a greatest number of chocolate volcanoes, infinitely many. Okay, putting aside questions of different orders of infinity and so on, infinitely many. Maybe it might not even matter, one. If you've got infinitely many chocolate volcanoes, that's enough. I don't actually know why the greatest conceivable island need have infinitely many chocolate volcanoes or coconuts or what have you, rather than just enough. But I don't buy this idea of an island with infinitely many chocolate volcanoes. I mean, where would the beaches be?
It's infinitely extended, so you got infinite room for the beaches.
Yeah. Well, okay. But how's that physically possible? I mean, consider the mass and weight of this thing. I mean, it would be infinitely massive.
It just needs to be conceivable, right? We're talking about conceivability and because we're talking about the ontological argument, right? So we don't really need to limit ourselves to physical possibility.
Your powers of conception might exceed mine here. I just I think that through. These are physical objects with infinite masses and so on. What happens under those conditions? I presume that long before we have an infinite number of volcanoes, this object would collapse in some sort of way. Maybe it would turn into a star or a black hole or something. That's no fun in Ireland, right?
No, it's not. But I mean, when we're talking about the greatest conceivable island, right? We can also conceive of different. I mean, I can make perfect sense of different laws of nature, at least conceptually. I mean, whether or not it's metaphysically possible is a separate question. But when we're talking about the ontological argument, right, we're kind of in the land of conceivability. And so I can at least conceive of different laws of nature that don't debar that don't make it collapse, and that allow this. Maybe we have different particles at play, so the masses work differently, and so on, right? So I think we might be able to, flesh it out.
Mm-hmm. Probably the right thing to say about this is that what really matters is possibility, not conceivability over here. Then we'd have to present the ontological argument over again in a better way.
Yeah, no, I was about to say, well, then that same rejoinder applies to Anselm, so.
Okay, yeah, right, exactly. Okay, exactly. So, and that's what I meant to say when I was saying that. Some people think that the notion of a greatest conceivable being isn't unproblematic. They don't think it's possible. Maybe to, in some sense of conceive, they can conceive of it, but that sense of conceive has very, very little philosophical weight, I think the critics would say. And similarly over here, we might say in some sense of conceive, maybe you can say, you can say the words, island with infinitely many volcanoes. You can conceive of such an island, but that sense of conceive has very little philosophical weight. Probably what matters when it comes to formulating the argument more carefully and thinking about the objections more carefully, is possibility. Is such a thing so much as possible? Mm-hmm. And then my concerns become real ones, right? Because I'm not sure it's metaphysically possible for there to be an island with infinitely many volcanoes. Though this would entangle us in discussions about, what physical laws are.
Yeah.
And you can now start to see how discussions about ontological arguments suddenly become
blossom. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
As well as, I mean, now we're getting into the kind of epistemology of modality, right? Like, so in debates concerning conceivability and whether or not it provides, defeasible or prima facie evidence for possibility, there's this whole question of, well, how much detail do you need to give, like when you're doing the conceiving, right? Do you need to kind of flesh out the possible world and talk about the variety of different laws and maybe its broader consequences? Like, in what detail do you need to imagine it in order to have sufficiently good, justification in order to affirm that you have indeed succeeded in conceiving of it and that you do in fact have defeasible evidence for its possibility? So, like you said, this kind of just blossoms into so many different philosophical avenues and yeah, dialectical paths. So that's also something that I really like about the ontological argument as well. So maybe we can, I mean, I guess another response to this intrinsic maxima rejoinder, right? That, oh, well, hey, the great making features of a being, those don't have, or they do have intrinsic maxima, whereas the great making features of an island, they don't have intrinsic maxima. I guess another response would be to find equally absurd situations or equally absurd beings, which are such that actually they do have intrinsic maxima with respect to their great making features. So, for instance, we can imagine like Plantinga's Mc-ear, right? So Mc-ear, its sole causal power is just to scratch its ear, or we can take some other thing. Maybe that's its only great making feature. It's scratching its ear, and so whenever it fulfills that or something like that, right, then it's better to the extent that it does that. I don't know, and I mean, that's a kind of on or off thing, like whether or not it scratches its ear. And in that case, there is a kind of intrinsic maxima, namely, it does scratch its ear. And so, if we conceive of the greatest conceivable Mc-ear, right, we could try to get like, oh well, it would be better if it existed in reality and in the understanding than if it just existed in the understanding, because its great making features are actually instantiated, and it doesn't have there is an intrinsic maximum, so you can avoid that objection. This is a bit like winding, but this is a bit detailed and complex way of presenting it. But I'm wondering what you think of, I guess, this general strategy of pinpointing equally absurd things like Ganilo's Island, right? But which do have intrinsic maxima. I'm wondering what you think about that kind of dialectical strategy.
First, I might be a little mixed up. It's been a while. I thought that the Mc-ear idea was supposed to show a puzzle for a certain definition of omnipotence.
Yeah, I've adapted it. Yeah.
Oh, okay. So you don't mean it in that. Okay, you've adapted it. Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, I didn't think the Mc-ear problem was a very big problem when it came to the omnipotence puzzle, but now we're talking. We haven't introduced that puzzle, and
Yeah.
and the way that the idea is used there, I don't know. That might be a bit of a detour. But the long and short of it, I guess, is that I don't think Mc-ear is a possible being. You see, I don't think all these. I'm pretty prejudiced against beings. I don't think Mc-ear is a possible being. Even in your formulation, I doubt that there could be a being whose sole power is the ability to scratch its ear. But still, I mean, it's just an example, right? There is a whole cottage industry of proposals of parodies of ontological arguments, fairies and ghosts and islands and so on. Maybe one of these, comes off. Maybe one of these parodies is perfectly parallel to, symmetrical with, and the premises are as plausible as the proposed being as possible as the existence of God, or God, or the ontological argument. I'm getting tongue-tied. Maybe the arguments are really parallel to the ontological argument. Maybe the beings they're on about are as possible as, conceivable as you want to put it, God is. And if so, that spells trouble for the ontological argument. Okay. We'd have to give it up unless we were willing to bite the bullet. And accept the existence of both these creatures, God and the Mc-ear, or the island, or the theory. theories, we'd have to give up on both, or on the arguments working in both cases. Maybe we could devise another ontological argument that is immune to those sort of parodies.
All right, sweet. So one final objection that we'll consider, and it's another kind of parody, but it's different from the ones that we've been considering. We'll move on to one final objection to Anselm, and then we'll move on to probably Descartes' ontological argument. So this last objection that we're going to consider is really a kind of worst conceivable being type argument. And so a worst conceivable being is essentially a being of maximal disvalue, like a maximally horrible being, a maximally vicious being, and so on. And so, we might mount an argument that's similarly parallel to the Anselmian ontological argument, but which gets us to the existence of a worst conceivable being. And so, for instance, we could say that, well, this worst conceivable being is understood and hence exists in the understanding, but if the worst conceivable being existed only in the understanding and not in reality, well, then we could conceive of something worse than the worst conceivable being, namely a being fitting the same description, but that actually exists. And that's a contradiction, right? We cannot conceive of something that's literally worse than the worst conceivable being. And so, by reductio, it follows that the worst conceivable being exists both in the understanding and in reality. And that's a bit scary, right? So, I guess, one of the contentious things here is whether or not it would actually add to the disvalue of, that is to say, decrease the value of the worst conceivable being for it to exist in reality, right? Now, that does kind of seem plausible, right? I mean, like, surely actually being vicious and actually being horrifically evil are worse for a being. That is to say, contribute to its badness or disvalue than, that is to say, compared to merely being vicious in the understanding but not in reality, or being horrifically evil merely in the understanding. That's surely like a bad-making or worse-making feature about a malicious and vicious things actually being instantiated in reality than merely existing in the intellect. And so I'm wondering what you think about this kind of worst conceivable being kind of argument and whether or not it successfully parodies the argument, whether or not it succeeds.
I don't know if the original argument succeeds. I doubt it. But I'm more skeptical of this one. A worst conceivable being. I mean, a being than which no worse can be conceived. Okay. And the argument's supposed to show that it exists. I mean, sometimes the parody is supposed to show that there isn't such a being.
Yeah.
Right. So there's a whole cottage industry of these parodies, and within this cottage industry, there's a cottage industry of devil parodies.
Yeah.
Right. And they go in different ways. Sometimes they're supposed to show that there couldn't be a greatest conceivable being, like if since it's greater to exist than not to exist.
Mm-hmm.
A being would be worse for not existing, and so the being than which no worse could be conceived could not exist, must not exist. I don't know what the trouble with that conclusion would be.
Yeah.
Would be happy to accept it if I, was adamant on accepting the original argument and found all these premises plausible enough. I don't have a problem with denying that the worst conceivable being exists. But what you're suggesting is the opposite, that we should think of a parody in which, of the ontological argument that has its conclusion that there is such a terrible being because it would be worse for it to exist. Well, worse for us for it to exist, I suppose. Maybe not worse for it to exist if existence is a great making property. Okay. And there might be a problem. Okay. Maybe this being shouldn't have existence if it's a great making property. Or maybe you want to say that existence is sometimes a great making property and sometimes not, depending on the kind of being it attaches itself to. But while there are these routes, it seems to me that the notion of a worst possible being is far less clear than the notion of a greatest conceivable being. I mean, whether the notion is coherent, whether such a being is possible, is less clear to me than the notion of a greatest conceivable being. Whether this being is possible. Okay. Because of some ideas I have, I mean, that don't really come up in this book, but the heart of it is independently. I think that certain divine attributes entail others. So I think that being all powerful entails being all knowing, and that entails being all good.
Yeah.
These thoughts do take us beyond the discussion of the ontological arguments, beyond anything I say in the book. But I do have this view that these attributes are tied up. If you have one, you've got to have the other. So when you try to draw a notion of the worst conceivable being, and I don't know how you spelt it out, but I've seen people spell it out as an omnipotent devil. Okay, a being that's all powerful yet very, very, very bad. Okay. I don't think that's possible. I don't think that's coherent. I think that as soon as you have a being that's all powerful, you have a being that's all knowing, and as soon as you have a being that's all powerful and all knowing, you have a being that's all good. So I don't think it makes sense to speak of an all powerful being who is all bad. Now, to make sense, to justify that and explain myself would take some time. Okay.
Yeah.
But that is what it comes to over here. So you've got to give up on the worst conceivable being all powerful, like an omnipotent devil. So it must have some degree of power less than omnipotence. Well, which is there a maximum degree of power less than omnipotence that you can fit with? I don't know if that makes sense.
Yeah.
And so quickly the idea of an omnipotent devil, quickly the idea of a worst, or the possibility. Maybe I shouldn't say the idea, because you get worried about conceivability and possibility. Maybe you get the heart of the matter. Quickly, the possibility of a worst conceivable being, flounders. It comes apart.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. No, that makes sense. That's interesting. So let's move on now to Descartes.
It's not like everybody should accept that answer, or will find plausible that answer to the parody objected. That you use to object to the ontological argument. It's not that everybody should accept my objection against the parody, because it does depend on certain ideas or principles about how these attributes are related, and then pessimism or skepticism about there being something less than, all powerful yet somehow a worst, some degree of power such that the worst being would have that degree of power, and there's no degree less than omnipotence but greater than this degree of power. People might dispute that, and they might dispute my whole picture of how omnipotence and omniscience and perfect goodness are interrelated. But that's what I think that's in the end what I would say about that devil parody.
Okay, no, that makes sense. So I'm actually really excited to get on to Plantinga's modal ontological argument. So within Descartes' ontological argument, we're just going to look at one objection after I articulate, the basic thrust and then turn it over to you. So we're only going to spend maybe like 5-10 minutes on Descartes' ontological argument. So apologies to all the Cartesians out there, but they're just going to have to deal with it. So the way that I learned about this argument was just this tricky little kind of two premise, one conclusion type of argument. And it's just, number one, a perfect being has every perfection by definition. But premise two, existence is a perfection. And so a perfect being has existence. That is to say, a perfect being exists. And so that's kind of the simple reconstruction that you put it in your book. Now, there's a more elaborate reconstruction in terms of what you clearly and distinctly perceive or understand or apprehend to belong to a concept or to belong to the nature or essence of something. Now, I'm wondering if you want to say anything more by way of explication here, or if we want to go on to the one objection that I want to consider, or I'll turn it over to you.
Descartes presents his ontological argument in different ways. And I think that what you presented as a simple reconstruction, well, it's close to what he has to say, and certainly close to what other early moderns who propose the argument say. Yeah, this is the argument they have, right? Perfect being has every perfection, existence is a perfection, so a perfect being exists. That's it. That's much easier to understand than Anselm's argument.
Yeah.
Descartes also has more elaborate ways of putting this, but I think they face the same problem. And even while these arguments are easier to understand, a little easier to follow than Anselm's, I think that they're also easier to shoot down. Yeah, that's my little gloss on your presentation.
Sweet. Okay. So I guess the one objection that I wanted to consider, which was the objection that I was kind of quote unquote taught in my kind of philosophical upbringing, was essentially a dilemma. And maybe this is one that, might convince you, or I'm not sure. I'll ask you after I present it, what you think are, I guess, or are the major problem or problems for the argument. So the objection that I was kind of taught was, well, listen, when Descartes says that a perfect being by definition has every perfection, he means either there exists an X such that X is perfect and X has every perfection, or he means if there exists a perfect being X, then X has every perfection, right? It's either the existential quantifier or the universal quantifier, and then when you have the universal quantifier, you're going to need to have the implication. And so it's ambiguous, really, what he's saying. So, when I say that a unicorn has a single horn, right? Like that's kind of ambiguous. Am I saying that there is an X such that X is a unicorn and X is a single horn, or am I saying that, well, listen, if unicorns existed, right, then they'd have a single horn? It's kind of ambiguous there, and so we have to kind of draw out that ambiguity between the existential quantifier one and the kind of conditional or universal quantifier one. And so if we understand it in the former way, namely that there exists an X such that X is a perfect being, right, and that has every perfection, well, then the argument's blatantly question begging. But if we accept the latter, right, if we accept the latter interpretation that if there exists a perfect being X, then X has every perfection, well, then the argument is like just trivial. Like the conclusion would be then, well, then if a perfect being exists, then a perfect being exists. So I'm wondering what you make of this response, whether or not this one is the one that you kind of settle on as the most powerful one. Yeah, I'll turn it over to you.
Yeah, again, I'm left with not much to say. You've said it well. That is a standard objection against this kind of formulation of ontological argument. There are other objections against Descartes' version. I mean, you could try parody it.
Yeah.
Again, some of the objections against Anselm, kinds of objections against Anselm apply here too. A perfect being has every perfection. Existence is a perfection. Therefore, a perfect being exists. That's the thought in a nutshell. Here's a parody. Okay. A perfect lion has every perfection a lion might have. Existence is a perfection a lion might have. Therefore, a perfect lion exists. Or maybe you do really have a favorite lion. So maybe a perfect unicorn. And of course, since we reject the existence of unicorns, including perfect unicorns, or even perfect lions, we must say that this line of kind of reasoning goes wrong. In this case, and then plausibly too in the case of the argument for the existence of God. Right? So there are other objections that apply to Descartes' arguments. What's nice about the one that you raised is that it kind of pinpoints the error. It doesn't just say, look, this must go wrong somewhere. Yeah. It shows us where. Look, the premises equivocate. It's ambiguous. A sentence of the form, a blah is blah. Okay. Might be saying there is a blah, that is this way. Or might be saying, if there were a blah, then it would be that way. Okay. A cat is on the mat, plausibly says, there's a cat on the mat, right? But a unicorn has one horn, plausibly says, if there's a unicorn, then, or every unicorn has one horn, but not committing to the existence of any unicorns. So which way are we to understand the premise here? A perfect being has every perfection. Like you say, understood the one way, as saying that there is a perfect being, then the argument's obviously question begging, right? You wouldn't accept the premise without already accepting the conclusion. Put the other way, it's impotent. Yeah, sure. Even the atheist can grant if there's a perfect being, then it exists. Right, right. That's a pretty innocuous and religiously uninteresting premise.
Yeah.
Are there ways out of this? One thing I suggest in the book is that maybe, again, the Monongian would have a way out of this. Maybe there's a way of understanding the sentence, A blah is blah, right? That isn't one of these ways. Okay. And maybe the Monongian has a third way for this premise to be construed. Okay. And then we once we construe the premise that way and run the argument through it, it avoids the two horns here, either being question begging or impotent. But again, that entangles us in that old debate about Meinong. That's at least a proposal I have in the book. But yeah, I think the objection you raise is a pretty powerful one. So I raise many others and suggest some solutions and so on in the chapter of the book.
Further reason to pick it up to all you listeners. So now let's move on to Plantinga's modal ontological argument. So as usual, I'll just give a kind of 30-second rundown. A necessary being is such that it cannot fail to exist. It must exist. It exists in all possible worlds, where a possible world is just a complete or total way that reality could be. And Plantinga's modal ontological argument uses a system of logic called S5. Now, S5's distinctive modal axiom says that whatever is possible is necessarily possible. So that is to say, what's possible doesn't vary from world to world. And in other words, what's possible and impossible, moreover, doesn't vary from world to world. So if something is impossible, well, then it's impossible in all worlds. So for instance, if a square circle is impossible, then it's impossible in all worlds, and so on. And so this S5 axiom, in fact, entails that whatever is possibly necessary is just necessary simpliciter, right? So you could just shave off that initial possibility quantifier. And so with that in mind, we can kind of unpack the argument. We can say, well, hey, there exists a maximally great being. And a maximally great being is just a being which is 1, omnipotent, 2, or I guess I should say essentially omnipotent, 2, essentially omniscient, 3, essentially morally perfect, and 4 is a necessary being. You know, if it exists in one world, it exists in all worlds. And so if you have that definition of a maximally great being, and if it's possible that there is such a being, well, then it's possibly necessary that such a being exists, because it's a necessary being, right? And by the S5 axiom, it follows that it's necessarily the case that such a being exists. And if something's necessarily the case, then it's obviously actually the case. And so there exists a maximally great being, i.e. God. And so, you know, that key premise is that possibility premise, that first one. And so typically, again, I'll turn it over to you for some symmetry breakers, but I just want to lay it out first. Typically, the response to this argument is just another kind of parallel argument, or a symmetry argument, or we could say reverse argument. And the argument is just that, well, hey, it seems another premise seems epistemically on par with that first premise. Namely, okay, possibly a maximally great being doesn't exist. There's at least one possible world in which a maximally great being doesn't exist. That seems to be on equal epistemic par with the premise that possibly a maximally great being exists. But these two lead to contradictory conclusions. One of them, per S5, leads to the necessary existence of such a being. The other one, per S5, leads to the impossibility of such a being. Because if it's possibly absent from reality, well, then it's not a necessary being, and so per the S5 axiom, it's impossible. Okay, that's a bit complex, but just for the audience, we now need a kind of symmetry breaker if you want to prefer one reverse or one possibility premise over the other. You need some consideration, some principled, non-ad hoc, non-question begging, non-arbitrary reason to favor one possibility premise vis-a-vis or in relation to or over and above the other possibility premise. And so this is where the kind of cottage industry, as you say, of symmetry breakers comes in, that try to break that symmetry in favor of one possibility premise, but not the other. So with that out of the way, do you want to talk about some symmetry breakers that you consider in your book?
Oh, that out the way. That was a lot.
Yeah, if you want to comment on that, clarify things, that's totally cool.
You say that it's, I guess you're right, that the question of whether a maximally great being is possible is going to be the real heart of this argument, though it's not like every other premise that you mentioned is uncontroversial. I did in the book want to discuss S5, and I had some objections against S5. I don't know what to make exactly of S5. But I had to cut them out because of word limit considerations. There was a strict word limit, and I got to like one word of it and called it a day. So it's not like the other premises of the argument are completely unassailable, though most of the audience, I think, will accept more readily those premises than the premise that a maximally great being is possible. Okay. And then the idea is once you accept that there's possibly a God, okay, possibly a maximally great being, then you have to, once you accept that there could have been such a being, then you have to accept that there is such a being. Because what is it for this being to be possible? It's for this being to exist, as you put it, in all possible worlds. It's for this being to exist necessarily. Okay. And if there's some possible world in which it exists in all possible worlds, then alas, it turns out that it exists in the actual world too. It actually exists. Okay. Or maybe not to put it in terms of possible worlds, the idea is if there could have been a being that could not have failed to exist, then as a matter of fact, it turns out, by the logic of could have and could not have failed to, if we think about these terms hard enough, it turns out that such a being must actually exist. So granting the mere possibility of a being that I've been leaning against this drape that's hanging over a closet in a closet in the basement, and I'm worried it's going to fall on my head. Okay. Whoa, there it goes. I really shouldn't be leaning so much. I'm like leaning back here, like, you know.
Oh, man.
Oh, damn. I hope I didn't break it.
Oh, man, that's just glorious.
Pretty chilly. Maybe I'll wrap myself in it. Well, there you can now see the back of a closet in my basement, but I get to feel a little warmer. I don't know if I can use this as a blanket.
I'm sure it's possible. It's possibly necessary, at least, so you actually are doing it.
It's pretty nice, you know. I think it's nice. It's like, I don't know if you can see the beads. I hope none of it broke. It's been hanging there a while.
They're maximally great.
I got it in Morocco at a conference.
Really?
Yeah. At a market there. That's lousy. I'm not going to even try to put that back. Well, I'm always on Zoom here. It's like pretty embarrassing. I've just got this rickety back of a closet. Also makes the room look a little nicer. It's just a mess.
It's all good. So we were talking about the possibility premise, and
this might fall on me. I was on a Zoom chat with somebody. I have a broken chair also sitting over there, and it collapsed under me as I just fell vertically straight down in the middle of the talk.
That's great.
Whatever it was. And I invested in a better chair. Maybe I should invest in a better basement altogether. Yeah, where were we?
So we were talking about you were on the could not have and could have, and so you were talking about, oh well, we don't even need the possible world semantics. You can just do it with the logic of could not have and could have, and so you were just kind of flagging that there are at least some other areas that are contestable, at least in principle, like the S5 axiom or the S5 system, that is, and so on. So maybe that's enough by way of explication, and maybe we want to get on to symmetry breakers.
Sure.
Okay, sweet. So, can you take us through the Samkara principle, or however you pronounce it?
Well, there we go. We have a trouble again, right?
I say Samkara. I don't know if maybe it's Samkara, maybe it's Samkara. I don't know.
I don't know. I've never had opportunity to to even speak about it. I just was going like Samkara or something like that. I don't know.
Samkara, that makes sense.
I don't know. It's a principle. It's a principle from a Hindu philosopher, I think, who lived maybe 1,000 or more years ago. I forget. I forget the full name of that philosopher. I don't think it's originally presented in the context of an ontological argument, though Alex Proust is the one who uses it in this context imaginatively. I don't imagine it is. If it were, then this philosopher would have discovered an ontological argument before Anselm, and I think, though it's controversial, little controversial, I think Anselm is the first proponent of anything like a real ontological argument. But Alex Proust, as is his way, has imaginative ways of bringing different topics and problems to bear on each other. I'm really bummed about that. And the idea is that the principle is that if something seems to be the case, then it's possible. It could be the case. Okay. If it seems to you that there's an elephant in the room, then there could be. It's possible for there to be. Not that there is, of course, right? There's not an elephant in the room. But or maybe there is if you see it vividly, and maybe there really is. There might be an elephant in your room, but you know what? If something seems to someone to be the case, then that's a defeasible reason for thinking that it's possibly the case. Okay, so if it seems to someone after ingesting LSD that there's a purple elephant in the room, we don't think that there is a purple elephant. Okay, but we do grant that it's possible for there to have been a purple elephant. Okay, so the principle gives the right verdict about that and other cases. It's serviceable. Maybe that's reason for believing it's true. Okay. On the other hand, impossible things seldom appear. Okay, you seldom have an experience as of an impossible thing. It doesn't seem to anybody, even under LSD, right, that there are square circles. I presume. I don't know. I haven't, haven't ever had LSD. I don't know. Have you had LSD?
Not that I recall.
Okay. But I don't know. Maybe some people would describe their experiences that way. But the idea is that it is seldom something. If something seems to be the case, then it's at least possible that it be the case. If it seems to you that there's a purple elephant or anybody, then at least you know this: a purple elephant is possible. Okay. It would be a problem for the principle, I suppose, if it faced too many counterexamples. If it did seem to people under the influence of LSD that there are square circles around them. But presumably, while people under the influence of LSD might see purple elephants, they don't see square circles. Right? When something seems to be the case, the idea is it's possible. Okay, that's the principle. However you wish to pronounce it. Okay. appearances are a guide to possibilities. It's pretty modest. Okay, not that appearances are a guide to what's real, though we might accept that in typical cases too. If something seems to be the case, well, that's a reason for believing it is the case. Seeing is believing, right? Unless you're under the influence of LSD. But even in that case, seeing is believing something's possible. And the next step is to recognize that it seems to many people in religious or mystical experiences that there is a perfect being. Many people have religious experiences, mystical experiences, as of being in the presence of God, or being forgiven by God, or judged by, so on. These may be more or less vivid, detailed religious or mystical experiences. Okay. Now there's a whole philosophical argument and debate about whether we should take these experiences seriously. Really? Are these mystics really, should we believe that they're really experiencing God? Are there experiences and testimony evidence for the existence of God? Okay. I was on a YouTube interview recently about the argument from religious experience, among other topics. Your listeners could Google it. But that's not the thought here. The thought isn't that mystical experiences of God, of a perfect being, that prophets and saints and ordinary people maybe who, in different religious traditions, they have these experiences. The idea isn't that these experiences directly provide evidence for the object of the experience, the putative object of the experience, God. The idea is just this, insofar as they're experiencing God, or seeming to experience God, as far as it seems to be the case that God exists to these people in their mystical experiences, well, the principle tell us it's possible for God to exist. Okay. Just as you're seeming to see a purple elephant is evidence of the possibility of a purple elephant, so you're seeming to experience God is evidence of the possibility of God. Not God, not directly at least, but the possibility of God. And that's all we need for the ontological argument to get off the ground. That's the idea.
Yeah. No, now, interestingly, I'm going to be, for the audience, I'm going to be making one of my future videos within the next month on this very symmetry breaker, because in my Philosophy 406 class with Paul Draper, this is what one of my term papers was on. So in Paul Draper's class, the subject is religious experience, and so we had a whole semester, or a whole unit on mystical experience, and so I chose this particular symmetry breaker from Proust, and I was going through a bunch of different, criticisms of the symmetry breaker and ways that we might, push back on it. And so I'm going to be, articulating some of that in one of my videos. That looks beautiful. It looks wonderful.
Trying to make it right with the world,
Yeah. Yeah. So I'll keep going while you're struggling.
You did so well.
So yeah, so for the audience, yeah, it looks beautiful.
It's right with the world.
So yeah, I'm going to be doing a video on this in the future, and I wrote one of my term papers on this, so I'm excited about it. I guess I should maybe I can just spring 3 different criticisms towards you, rapid fire, and then we'll hear what you think on them, and I can remind you if you forget about some of them. So the first criticism is like, well, hold on, it just relocates rather than resolves.
What was the first criticism?
Oh, that's what I'm about to articulate.
I forgot.
So I'm about to articulate that, yeah. I have 3 different criticisms. Well, I've more than that, but I'll just give these rapid fire to you, and we'll see what we think. So the first one is that I don't think it resolves symmetry, but rather seems to relocate it. Why is that? Well, because plausibly there are cases of atheistic religious, well, quote unquote religious experience. I guess we can call them atheistic experiences, right? So Paul Draper details in one of his papers, I think it's his paper, Pain and Pleasure, an Evidential Problem for Theists, the 1989 one. He talks about how many atheists have...
Talk about forgetfulness.
I know. So he talks about...
Were people even doing philosophy of religion in 1989? Were people even doing philosophy?
Yeah, well, who knows? That's well, maybe it's true, but they don't exist, but they are there. Who knows? Okay, we're getting ahead of ourselves. Anyway, so Paul Draper, right? He talks about how many people seem to have profound experiences wherein they seem to not merely have an absence of an experience of God, but experience God's absence.
Really? Many people?
Well, yeah, like a lot of people are led to deconversion, for instance, when they seem to experience the sort of poignant indifference of nature or reality, ultimate reality to their suffering and languishing. He talks about,
Should
yeah,
I
he just,
should I preface my response with, as an expert on absences?
That's great. Well, okay, so yeah, well, that's the first one. It's essentially like, listen, there are these kind of atheistic experiences where, for instance, you might be, you just have this kind of poignant sense, this poignant seeming of the ultimate indifference of nature to the flourishing and languishing of, for instance, sentient creatures. And if you have that seeming, well, then per the Samkhata principle, it's possible that ultimate reality is indifferent. But if God existed, and if he necessarily existed, then ultimate reality would necessarily not be so indifferent to the suffering and languishing of creatures. And so, we have the symmetry back again, right? We have the possibility that God doesn't exist because possibly reality is ultimately indifferent, but also the seemings attest to the possibility that God does exist. So these kind of atheistic experiences that oftentimes even lead people to kind of deconversion. They're profound experiences. Oh, I guess another way to appreciate this is when, for instance, when I myself sometimes read accounts of what happened in historical atrocities, things like what happened in the gulags or what happened in Auschwitz and things like that, right? I almost get the poignant sense that these evils, these horrendous evils, are intrinsically impermissible for any being whatsoever to allow them. There's this distinctive sense. It's almost like a religious experience of the intrinsic impermissibility of the obtaining of these horrors. And when you read the literature in the Problem of Evil literature on horrors, you can really start to appreciate that, I think. And so if I have that seeming, right, of, for instance, maybe the gratuity of the evil, or maybe it's intrinsic impermissibility to allow because it's so horrendous, and then that would entail that it's at least possible that these things would be intrinsically impermissible or gratuitous. And then, moreover, that in turn would presumably entail the possibility that God doesn't exist, if they are in fact intrinsically impermissible for any being to allow, because then God would be morally blameworthy. So what do you think?
I haven't thought of that before. I don't know. I'd like to know more about these experiences.
Yeah, the phenomenology, things like
Alleged
that.
non-existence of God. That's one question. Like, also, it might come to, if we're coming to a sort of, I don't know, loggerhead. I don't know what the word is. Like, there evidence in the one from the one direction from seemings of God for the possibility, and evidence in the other direction when it comes to seemings, of the absence of God as evidence that God isn't possible. You might think they just neutralize each other, so we should be agnostic about the possibility of God, just in light of this evidence, so far as this goes. But it might not be so simple as that. You might want to say that, look, there's evidence in one direction for the possibility, evidence in the other direction against the possibility, and maybe things are a little messier. Maybe we've got to take into account numbers. How many people have the one sort of experience, and how many people have the other? And maybe there are just more people that have mystical experiences of God than of the absence of God.
Yeah.
Just a question. I don't know. These seem to be partly empirical questions, and I'd like to know more about these negative-ish experiences.
Yeah. Yeah.
But apart from that, there's also, I'm worried about the way the principle's put. The way it was put originally is what seems to be the case, possibly is the case. Now, what you're suggesting, though, it might require a different kind of principle. If something seems not to be the case, then its absence is possible. Are those equivalent principles? I mean, can we knock out that principle? Can we Can your argument rely on the very same Sankara principle, or is it relying on a principle about seeing that maybe it's the same principle? If something seems to be the case, then it's possible. An absence seems to be the case, the absence of God in this case. Therefore, the absence of God is possible.
Yeah, or something that were it actual, it would entail the absence of God. Like the intrinsic impermissibility stuff, the gratuity stuff.
Okay. Yeah. So maybe it is the same principle. I was at first thinking, look, maybe your argument's not relying on the same principle, and so the principle it's relying on might be a little more controversial. Your principle, if something seems not to be the case, then it's possibly not. Whereas the principle I'm relying, or Proust is relying on, if something seems to be the case, then it possibly is. And then, we might wonder, is your principle as plausible? But as Proust's principle, the Samkara principle. But maybe it is the same principle. Maybe, it seems to be that an absence, therefore an absence is possible. Or maybe the principle's, okay, so let's say it's the same principle. We might want to qualify it. Maybe we'll want to say, look, appearances of absences are weird things. Okay. Sometimes they're weird things, I know what it's like for it to seem possible that there's a unicorn. There's this image in my mind's eye, or I have a sort of visual experience of a horse-like thing with a horn. What is the experience of there being no unicorn? I mean, in some ways, it's pretty clear, the experience of there being no unicorn in this room, right? I look around. Look like there's a unicorn here. But let's say more generally, just the experience of the absence of unicorns from the universe. What's the positive content of that experience? I mean, what's its phenomenology? What is it like? I don't know. I'm scratching my head. I'm really wondering whether we might have problems here with genuine experiences of total absences.
Yeah, no, I actually tend to agree with you there. That's why I actually probably tend to prefer an application of this principle to a case where it's not merely like a total absence, but rather it's more so you're experiencing something that, were it to be actual or were it to be true, it would entail the non-existence of God. And hence, when you get the possibility of that thing, then you can just get the possible non-existence of God from the Samkara principle in your seeming. So
yeah,
I agree with you.
But you've also got that extra step in the way you put it, right?
Yeah, I mean,
not a direct seeming of the absence of God, but a seeming of something that itself is supposedly incompatible with the existence of God. Well, you've also got the step to prove that this is really incompatible with the existence of God.
That's true. That's
the
true.
argument might be a little weaker there. I don't know what to say about this. It's a clever idea. Maybe this is a problem with the argument. Maybe we should treat appearances and appearances of absences in the same way, symmetrically, and so just as the appearance of God is some reason for thinking God possible, the appearance of the absence of God, if we can wrap our minds about what that appearance means or is evidence that the existence of God is impossible, is some evidence that the existence of God is impossible. I haven't thought of that before. I might have to think of it further. That's a clever idea. It's not the reason. I mean, I myself don't accept the support of the possibility premise, right? But not on these grounds. So I'm not committed to your objection not working. Fine if your objection works. I think I have my own objection, or rather I think my own or the objections of others works too in that case.
Yeah. So that your objection was going to be the third one that I was going to articulate. So these will be the last two ones to sort of end out our conversation or our episode. So maybe we've got 10 minutes left or something like that. But if that's okay with you, so the second kind of criticism that I wanted to level was that, hold on a second, right? When we were applying the Samkara principle, we also need to take into account other aspects of the phenomenology of mystical experiences themselves. And in my lights, Proust seems to ignore other elements of mystical experience that are thoroughly inimical to his project of vindicating the modal ontological argument and traditional theism. In particular, mystical experiences and mystics often have an experience of what's called union without distinction. And this union without distinction, I think, serves as a kind of counterexample to Proust's symmetry breaker. And so lots of mystics, excuse me, lots of mystics claim when they're in their kind of high, states of mystical experience, they claim that the subject object or mystic God structure of the experience seems to them to disappear entirely. And it in fact led some mystics, many mystics actually, to claim identity with God. And they were actually like castigated by other members of certain communities for such claims. But nevertheless, it was based wholly on what they were experiencing. They have this kind of experience of union with God without distinction, and that leads a lot of them to claim identity with God. But
a lot of mystics claim to be God.
Yeah, in their experience, they claim identity with God. Yes.
Well, there are lots of mystics who claim to be God.
Well, there are a number of examples, I guess I should say. Mm-hmm. I can pull up well, maybe I can put it in the
yeah. So
description.
here I'm wondering again, like, okay, we might say, hey, look, counterexample against the principle. Obviously, these people are not identical with God.
Yeah.
But you might also think that it's not so simple. Maybe, insofar as we have evidence for the principle, maybe we should discount these cases or somehow accommodate them in some way. Or maybe we should say that, look, well, the union being reported is maybe a bit of an exaggeration or something. I don't know how many mystics claim to be literally identical with God. And that's just the question. How many people claim to be God?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Right?
Yeah, we went through...
It happens often?
Well, we went through in our class a bunch of different mystics, and at least some of them, there's this phenomenon, and it's called union without distinction, and they have an experience as of union with God without being distinct from God, and that led some mystics, and there are like recorded examples on the basis of their mystical experience. I wish I had my lecture notes open because I'd be able to like cite them for you, but it led them to claim identity with God. What?
That's what I was saying in classes. I wish I had my notes open.
Yeah.
So as a lecture, anyhow. So the idea, there's a philosophical sense of there being no distinction, and then there's a loose popular sense of there being no distinction, right? You might say when a droplet falls into the ocean, there's no distinction anymore. Okay. In a popular sense, that right, okay, they're sort of blended. But you don't want to say the ocean strictly and philosophically. The droplet and the ocean are one thing. No. Okay. Maybe you can say romantically that's someone and their beloved. There's no distinction. They've just sort of fallen into each other, and that's fine. It conveys something important, but strictly and philosophically, it's not true. So when these mystics are saying that, they have this unitive experience with, are they saying strictly and philosophically that they are one and the same thing as God? That God is nothing over and above them, to put it that way. I don't know if there are many who claim that. And that's the part that we find really implausible, I presume. But maybe I'm mistaken. Maybe I'm just mistaken on the nature and popularity of these kinds of mystical experiences. I guess I could do these texts in your notes convey that these mystics take themselves to be strictly and literally identical. God is nothing over and above them. They are God. Is that what they are claiming? Or are
That's
they
how
claiming?
that's how Draper was conveying it, and I'm currently just looking up the phenomenon of mystical union, and it does seem to be um, it's talking about mystical identity and expressing indistinction between God and human. At least they say at least on some level of reality. It seems as though, we would have
These, of
to.
course, wouldn't be traditional Jewish, Christian, or Muslim mystics. None of them could claim this because then they'd be claiming that they were God.
Oh, exactly. That's why a lot of them received castigation from non-mystics, and they were saying how no, this isn't veridical,
I've
and
never heard of a respected Jewish mystic making such a claim. I would be shocked if. I mean, okay. You you might say, look, there's a lot of evidence for our principle. These people, maybe they're misdescribing things, or they're lying, or something like that. You
but the
could.
point the point though is just that, well, listen, Bruce, we can say the same thing when they're talking about God and the maximally great being and their experience as of God. Maybe they're lying. Maybe they're
There are a lot of
deceptive.
people having these experiences as of God, supposedly. And how many mystics are really claiming to be God?
Well, like the high mystics, oftentimes, I'll have to share with you my notes.
I won't doubt that millions of people have experiences. We might get in some debate about whether these experiences are, as you put it, veridical, genuine experiences of God. But I think we can doubt that people have experience as of being, because millions of people report it. But how many people report being one and the same as being God? I mean, and are they being honest? Do they really know what they're experiencing? Are their eyes shifty? Are they all that intelligent? You've got to ask these questions. The first question I ask when someone says that they're God, right? Um, I hold my wallet close. Not that there's much in it, but I wonder, are these people being honest? Um, so I don't know. We'll have to look at these details. I don't know about this. I haven't investigated this.
Yeah, I mean, probably depends on how we characterize their phenomenology and looking more into like the mystical states of mystical union and things like that. But there's some interesting stuff that I can send you after this, and I
Or
might be
we
able to
give
put
up
it in
the
the
principle.
description.
I'm happy to give up. I don't think this argument works.
Yeah, that okay. So let's get
So,
into the
so
third. Let's get
it's
into the
it's
third
it's
and
fine.
final.
It's fine. I can live with these objections.
Let's
I'm
get
not
into
I'm
the
not promoting the argument. So
let's get into
get
the
in.
third and final criticism, which is the one that you kind of level, and it kind of has to do with the what I think her name is Caroline Franks Davis. What she calls in her book on religious experience the ramification of the descriptions of the experiences. So it seems as though Proust is ascribing a mistakenly high degree of ramification. That is to say, like highly theoretical concepts and claims that go far beyond the experiential character and the phenomenological character of the experiences themselves, right? Like surely no one can experience omniscience of God. Like how do they tell apart God being super knowledgeable from being omniscient? And how do they tell apart like omnipotence from being utterly super powerful but maybe not being able to do everything? Like, and
Right.
especially like how do they experience the necessary existence of God?
Yes.
Like
Right. Right. What
um
is the phenomenal content of necessary existence? How does that appear?
yeah, exactly.
Is it square? Is it like is it red or blue? Does it have a certain auditory? I mean, is it a high pitch or low pitch? What is the experiences of purple elephants? They have a certain phenomenal content. We can spell it out. What is this? What's the substance of the experience of necessary being? What does it look like? Is it sui generis? Is it just? It seems to you that there's a necessary being. Um, so that's a question. Like, what is the content of these? What is the content of an experience of a necessary being? Like, what is it like? Like, should we really think? And does the mystic have a way of distinguishing
Yeah.
his experience of a God that is contingent versus his experience of a God that is necessary? That's the way of putting it. Or, an experience of a God that is super, super, super duper powerful, but not omnipotent. Like, will these feel different to the mystic? Should he really, or she really trust that they've seen this rather than that, or have seemed to seem this rather than that? And if your answer is no, then that's a problem, right? If we think that what appears to the subject isn't necessary being, or that the subject couldn't distinguish necessary being from contingent being in experience, or couldn't distinguish omnipotence from something less in experience. How could they? What's the different feeling you have being in the presence of omnipotence versus being in the presence of super duper power, but not omnipotence? Then the principle gives evidence of the possibility of something, but not necessarily evidence of doesn't show the possibility of a necessary being or an omnipotent being over and above the possibility of a really impressive being, but somewhat less than Godish being. So this is an objection that I think is has some force.
Yeah.
But maybe there are more objections against the this is an objection against the principle. This grants the principle.
Yeah.
If something appears to be the case, then it's possible is the principle, and it questions, well, what really is appearing to be the case? Your objections work, then we should also give up the principle itself. And they sound like interesting objections. I hadn't come across them, and I haven't thought of them, so I look forward to this term paper. Maybe you can turn it into a published paper too.
I'm hoping to, yeah. I'm hoping to develop them further and draw on some of the phenomenology of mystical experience as well. So fingers crossed. But that's a project after some of my other projects. But I think that was a lovely discussion, and probably going to have to go into closing remarks now. So thank you so much, Tyron, for joining me and talking about ontological arguments. Do you have any sort of closing remarks of where people can find your work or things like that, and any closing remarks about this discussion?
Yeah, the book is a little and short book. You can take it to the beach and read it in an afternoon, but it tries to condense and distill what I took to be the most important ontological arguments and objections and replies and so on to them. I don't think that the argument works, but I think it's interesting. As for my other work, well, I have this non-being-y edited volume coming out. Maybe it'll be heavier than this one, even though it's on a lighter subject. Well, lighter. I mean that in a, the lightness of non-being sense. I have a co-authored book on Hume that's also coming out. That's some 400 pages, so that's bigger than this one. They could find these, this stuff online if they want to read more of my work, if I haven't put them off enough already. But if even if your listeners don't enjoy it, and even if you haven't, I enjoyed speaking with you tonight. I didn't enjoy that falling, but the rest of it was just fine.
That was one of the most eventful things that's ever happened in some of my conversations anyway. So I thank you so much for coming on. And the audience, again, you guys can check the link in the description for a whole host of links, really, and arguments and things like that. Link to the document that we made in preparation for this. Lots of goodies. So definitely be sure to check that out. What more is there to say? Then I'm Joe Schmidt, and this is The Majesty of Reason, and peace out.